As their dizziness lessened, the spinning effects of the space-time cyclone outside the room slowed. But then, Bokra and Suzanne started spinning inside the room. Was some demented carnival scientist tormenting them with a spinning puzzle? Probably not, but it was certainly beginning to appear that way. Spinning becomes boring after a while, and even though the visual effects were startling, Bokra and Suzanne both found the incessant spinning to be a bit much. At nearly the same time, they began thinking there must be some way to control their spinning, as they had already been able to control the spinning outside the room. And as they pondered this idea, their spinning inside actually did begin to decrease. In fact, The more they thought about not spinning, the less they spun. But although they were beginning to be able to exercise some control over the spinning, neither of them felt ready to say anything about this, perhaps because they continued to be screaming. Nevertheless, in a few moments, in a way similar to the one which had caused all the spinning quickly to become boring, screaming was beginning to become something they both realized had evolved into a quite pointless activity as well. Hence, instead of focusing on spinning and screaming, they now focused on moving themselves into a stable orientation, to the extent which primarily third-dimensional beings can be oriented in any stable way within a fourth-dimensional carnival ride. And they also focused themselves on not screaming. Perhaps it will prove enlightening to remark that Bokra and Suzanne were not only spinning around and about, but also within and throughout, albeit a bit more slowly now. If Bokra had ever wondered what it would be like to be inside Suzanne's mind, he need never concern himself again with wondering what this might be like now, because he had spun all around and within Suzanne as she had spun about and throughout Bokra. In a few moments, everything stabilized, and Bokra and Suzanne realized they had discovered one of the rules of being in this strange room. They were less than entirely certain precisely what the rule actually was, but it did not matter so much really. The important thing was that they were successfully controlling something about the room. And if something about the room could be controlled, then it appeared likely to them that more could be controlled. Put another way, their situation appeared to be improving. As all this happened, they heard a not-so-subtle, reverberated metallic whoosh, and the vertical space-time cyclone suddenly transformed itself into a horizontally curving tunnel, which appeared to extend infinitely forward and backward through space-time. Bokra and Suzanne then both felt and saw the strange room become a transparent, ellipsoidally shaped capsule within which they were now traveling. And simultaneously, the control panel, which they had temporarily forgotten in all the excitement, changed into a thoughtfully placed instrument console, complete with comfortable-looking flight seats. In the same way that Bokra and Suzanne were learning how to control the strange room, it was learning how to tailor itself to their perceptual abilities, and everything was beginning to make a bit of sense. They were not trapped in a space-time carnival ride gone berserk. Not at all. Instead, they were traveling through a space-time tunnel in an ellipsoidal glass capsule that had an instrument console and comfortable flight seats. Consequently, the next set of perceptions Bokra and Suzanne began to ponder fell somewhere between amazement and amusement. Why not? Their current perceptions certainly made more sense than the immediately preceding spinning and bouncing here, there, and everywhere which they had just experienced. Bokra and Suzanne were definitely heading someplace. So now they began concentrating on determining precisely when and where it might be. After sitting in the comfortable-looking flight seats, maneuvers they performed in the same way that first-time spaceship passengers tend to combine their desires to explore the unusual with their needs to do something familiar, a curious combination of motivations which overall tend to encourage travelers to seat themselves quickly. Bokra and Suzanne rather automatically began studying the various dials, gauges, buttons, levers, and displays on the console directly in front of them. While one might expect reasonably that the visual effects of traveling in an ellipsoidal, transparent capsule through a gently curving and flowing space-time tunnel should be nearly overwhelmingly fascinating, which of course it was, Bokra and Suzanne were experienced pilots who were trained to focus diligently on discovering how better to control whatever they might be flying, since this was nearly always the most sensible thing to do in such circumstances. Looking at the console, Suzanne noticed there was a big lever conveniently located within easy reach of both flight seats, similar to the throttle or speed control of an airplane or a boat. The big lever was approximately in the middle of its range, and closer inspection revealed there was a vertical infinity symbol at the forward end of the lever's range, while at the back end of the lever's range there was a horizontal infinity symbol. Intuitively, Suzanne decided that virtually anything in the middle of its range might not be disturbed so dramatically by moving it a little bit forward or backward, and in this case, either away from horizontal infinity but toward vertical infinity, or toward horizontal infinity but away from vertical infinity. And consequently, she moved the big lever backward a tiny bit toward the horizontal infinity symbol. The space-time capsule slowed perceptibly, while at the same time the space-time tunnel felt more horizontal but curved sideways to the right by a small amount, which she thought was a quite curious thing for it to do, until she noticed a smaller lever located to the right of the big lever. This smaller lever having a right-facing arrow at its forward position and a left-facing arrow at its backward position. We interrupt this broadcast with a sua sponte silly announcement. Professor Alphonse Twiddle of the Department of Absurd Physics will now give a brief lecture entitled What the Big Lever Does, more or less with examples.
One way to understand the differences among horizontal infinity and vertical infinity is to imagine a special type of turret, perhaps a turret of a tank, which is parked on level ground with its tracks running parallel to a north-south line. But instead of the tank turret having one barrel, it has two barrels. One barrel facing in one direction while the other barrel faces in the exactly opposite direction. When one barrel faces due north, the other barrel faces due south. And in this example, the fully backward position of the big lever, which corresponds to horizontal infinity, results in the barrels being aligned along the east-west axis, in much the same way that the wings of a supersonic airplane align with the fuselage, essentially to form a cross, a plus sign, or something that does not look at all like a circle. If you took an aerial photograph of the tank with its turret in the full horizontal position and mapped it to an x-axis and a y-axis, the barrels of the turret would form the x-axis, while the tracks of the tank would run parallel with the y-axis. But while this is a useful step in visualizing the mechanism, forget about the tank tracks, because the big lever only controls the barrels of the tank. Another way to visualize this is to imagine that the tank is on a level plane and is pointing towards the horizon, something which is very difficult for a tank not to do, really. When the big lever is all the way back to in the full horizontal infinity position, the barrels run parallel to the horizon. If the tank is pointing toward the northern horizon, then one barrel points east while the other barrel points west, which is very good. Yet another way to visualize this is to set a pocket watch on top of a table and then to look directly downward at the face of the pocket watch. When the big lever is in the full horizontal infinity position, one barrel of the turret points at 9, while the other barrel points at 3. When the big lever is in the full vertical position, all the way forward, one barrel of the turret is pointing straight upward from the table through the center of the pocket watch, while the other barrel of the turret is pointing straight downward through the center of the pocket watch and through the table. In terms of axis, full horizontal infinity might be considered to be the x-axis, while full vertical infinity might be considered to be the z-axis. If you were in the tank and wanted to fire around at an airplane which was directly overhead, you would push the big lever all the way forward and then pull the trigger for the barrel, which was then pointing directly upward into the sky. Somewhat intuitively, the middle position of the big lever corresponds to the y-axis. Hence, if another tank is directly in front of your tank, and you want to fire around at that tank, you simply move the big lever to the middle position and pull the trigger for the forward-facing barrel. Unless, of course, you happen to be facing backward at the time, in which case you would pull the other trigger. From this, it should be easy to understand that as the big lever moves from its backward position to its middle position, the barrels of the turret move from 9, 3 to 12 and 6, respectively. When the big lever moves from its middlemost position to its forwardmost position, the barrels of the turret move counterclockwise from 12 and 6 to form a line that runs vertically parallel and perpendicular through the center of the pocket watch. And since this line was first described in the literature by Professor W.C. Kunga of the Institute for Physics and Modern Dance, it is often called the Kunga line by trained professionals such as myself. When the barrels are in the 10, 2, and 4 positions, the war stops and everyone enjoys a refreshing Dr. Pepper. Friends and enemies form groups for such topics as current events in retrospect and what the holidays mean to me are discussed. Those soldiers who enjoy knitting and quilting grab their arts and crafts kits and work on their favorite projects while sharing their most intimate personal feelings, dreams, and desires with the group. This continues until the Dr. Pepper runs out, at which time the war resumes and everyone goes back to destroying and killing everything in sight. This is mostly what the big lever does, and if you think about it for a while, you should realize that it is completely insufficient by itself to point the barrels of the tank everywhere. If you were actually in a tank, you would not be happy to find this lever. But fortunately, the big lever only works with infinity. And simply stated, infinity is a bit strange, really.
Thank you, Professor Twiddle. We now return to the broadcast and apologize profusely for this bit of sua sponde silliness. Since her movement so far with the big lever had produced results that appeared to be sensible, she decided to use the smaller level to the right as a trim control, which she moved slightly backward, with the result being that the curving of the space-time tunnel to the right adjusted until it was no longer curving to the right, but instead appeared once again to be straight. The next thing that Suzanne noticed was another small lever, which was located to the left of the big lever rather than to its right. This smaller lever on the left side of the big lever also had an arrow at each end of its forward and backward range, but instead of having a right and left arrow, its arrows faced forward and backward respectively. Now, this set of levers was beginning to make a bit of sense. The big lever controlled horizontal and vertical infinity, whatever that meant, while the smaller lever, located on the right side of the big lever, controlled left and right curving, and the smaller lever, located on the left side of the big lever, controlled forward and backward or perhaps up and down, of something which at present Suzanne had not yet identified. Perhaps these levers mapped to the pitch, roll, and yaw controls with which she was so familiar. Pondering this for a moment, with particular attention given to the quite puzzling few minutes earlier, during which she had appeared to be spinning about and throughout Bokra, while at the same time he had appeared to be spinning around and within her, a sensation that she simply could not describe fully, Suzanne began looking for a fourth control, which she was certain must be somewhere if she and Bokra were actually traveling at least a little bit in the fourth dimension. Just as quickly as she thought this, she noticed there was a little button on the top of the ball that formed the handle of the big lever, and without giving the matter much additional thought, she pressed the little button. What happened next was as entirely fascinating as it was equally frightening, because what had been a very sensible, logical, and orderly visual scene in which she and Bokra were traveling forward through a reasonably straight, gently flowing space-time tunnel in a transparent, ellipsoidal capsule rather dramatically transformed into what one might expect to see when traveling through the air in a 1960 Ford Thunderbird that had somehow morphed itself into an airplane which was flying very rapidly through a long and apparently endless series of drive-in movie theater screens, each of which was showing a different movie that was profoundly real in a three-dimensional sense, but just as sufficiently fourth-dimensional to allow flying through it with only minimal interactions. Noticing that the little button had extended a bit after she pressed it, and that the now extended button felt fluid in the sense that it had a range of movement upward and downward, Suzanne moved the little button slightly downward, and the space-time capsule responded by presenting the frames of the movies more slowly. Bokra, who had been attempting quietly to observe and to understand everything that Suzanne was doing so smoothly, began to see a pattern in the series of movie frames through which he and Suzanne appeared to be flying. And in his spontaneously designated role as space-time capsule co-pilot, he decided to make a suggestion to Suzanne, which appeared to him to be very sensible. Suzanne, move the little button downward a bit and slow the progression of the movie screens. Suzanne moved the little button downward a bit more, and just as Bokra had predicted, the progression of the movie screen slowed to a more visually comfortable rate. Now that the movie screens were moving more slowly, it became possible to recognize more of what was happening in each movie. And when one of the movie screens looked to be interesting, Bokra asked Suzanne to click the button, which she did, with the result being that for whatever practical purposes might exist in a space-time tunnel, Bokra and Suzanne were now watching an interesting movie in a most strange space-time drive-in movie theater. If there had been windows on the space-time capsule like there were on a 1960 Ford Thunderbird, Bokra might have been tempted to roll down the window on his side for the goal of getting a speaker. But there were no side windows on the space-time capsule, and even though it appeared certainly logically to be just as sensibly appropriate, there also were no soft drinks and popcorn. No sooner had Bokra thought to himself that it would be nice to be able to hear the movie, sound suddenly appeared. And the sense of being at a drive-in movie theater became all the more real. As had Bokra, Suzanne now was really beginning to want a Coca-Cola and some popcorn. And since both she and Bokra were having the same thought, it did not appear so strange to them that right at that moment, a black high-heel slipper with an ankle strap and an open toe pulled next to the space-time capsule. A curious little face peered over the inside of the black high-heel slipper and introduced itself. "Greetings, I am Ogly Nogly, keeper of the space-time tunnel. Would you like a Coca-Cola and some popcorn?" Bokra and Suzanne, who at this point were quite beyond being able to be startled or surprised very much by anything, looked over at Ogly Nogly and replied in unison, "Oh yes." Ogly Nogly disappeared for a moment inside the black high-heel slipper and soon reappeared with a small tray on which there were 2 6-ounce glass bottles of Coca-Cola and 2 boxes of popcorn. Ogly Nogly leaned over the edge of the slipper and handed the small tray to Suzanne through the side of the space-time capsule, an action which appeared to make as little or as much sense as anything else that had happened. And rather than question how Ogly Nogly did this, Suzanne took the small tray and said, "Thank you, Ogly Nogly." Ogly Nogly smiled and replied, "You are most welcome." Ogly Nogly then asked Suzanne, "Do you like my slippers?" Suzanne looked at Ogly Nogly's curious vehicle and observed, "It certainly is stylish, and I like the open toe. The ankle strap is a nice touch, too." Ogly Nogly brightened visibly and noted, "When I saw it in the showroom, I had to have it. It is so much better than a boot. I never did like a boot, really. As keeper of the space-time tunnel, I do a lot of traveling, and there is nothing better than a high-heel slipper for traveling." Bokra looked over at Ogly Nogly and remarked, "If the shoe fits, wear it. It's nearly always excellent advice." Ogly Nogly handed Suzanne a box of good and plenty candy and asked her to give it to Bokra, apparently as a reward for saying something remarkably observant and relevant, although Bokra was unlikely to understand at the moment precisely why his remark was so remarkably observant and relevant. As he handed Suzanne the box of good and plenty candy, Ogly Nogly told Suzanne, "There is a ripple in the space-time tunnel just ahead, and I am going to fix it. Do not be alarmed by what you see. Suzanne, it is normal, really. If you have never seen a Hilbert space hula hoop being used, it can appear to be a bit confusing. Making a lot of noise helps, so when I start making a lot of noise, you and Bokra should make a lot of noise too." Ogly Nogly handed Suzanne a drum, a wood block, and a pair of drumsticks. And while Bokra and Suzanne were both wondering how Ogly Nogly knew their names, Ogly Nogly winked at Suzanne and told her, "These are fun, and they make a lot of noise. Not so much as a cymbal or a gong, but enough, I think." About this time, a very visible ripple in the space-time tunnel appeared just ahead of the space-time capsule, on the other side of the fourth-dimensional movie screen and to the right of Ogly Nogly's slipper. In a series of movements which occurred very rapidly, Ogly Nogly dove into the toe of the slipper, shot out of the open toe while holding a Hilbert space hula hoop, and flew like a cannonball toward the ripple in the space-time tunnel. When Ogly Nogly was very near the center of the space-time ripple, Ogly Nogly started spinning the Hilbert space hula hoop, which soon became a rapidly spinning burr that was quite finitely orthogonal, something which intuitively made excellent sense to Bokra and Suzanne, although neither of them understood consciously why it did. At the same time, Ogly Nogly, who now was completely inside the rapidly spinning Hilbert space hula hoop, started making a lot of noise, and since this appeared to be what they also were supposed to be doing, At this instant in space-time, Bokra and Suzanne started making as much noise as they could by beating the drum and banging the woodblock with the drumsticks. In the distance, but not so far away, really, Ilgo, who was the mirror image of Ugly Noggly, also was making a lot of noise. But instead of beating a drum, banging a woodblock, and doing whatever Ugly Noggly was doing to make its noise, Ilgo was screaming instructions to a very frustrated robot that was attempting, quite unsuccessfully, to find a way to get the ripple in the space-time tunnel open sufficiently enough toward the goal of attaching a grappling hook to the ankle strap of Ugly Noggly's beautiful, open-toe, black high-heel slipper. Ilgo really wanted that slipper. And this is the 9th chapter of Extreme Gravity, Bokra and Suzanne lost in someplace. The new radio play written by J.D. Evans Jr., starring Elvis D. Tripp and his traveling troupe of strange voices, and featuring the musical stylings of Milford Little and his finger puppet marching band. With Sue Esponte, the announcement by Warful the Potato. Stay tuned for the next chapter in Extreme Gravity, Darla's Sexy Dance. This has been presented to you by the fabulously fabulous, marvelously marvelous, wonderfully wonderful science fiction theater of the imagination